This is Billy Kay with the Complete Caledonian Imbiber, celebrating the historic Scottish drouth for wine, beer and whisky. This is my archived programme from 1994 with music by Rod Paterson and John Martin and readings by Peter Raffin. Episode 5, The Craiter and Reamin Swats.
Gae bring to me a pint of wine and fill it in a silver tassy, that I may drink before I go a service stay, my bonny lassie.
Welcome to the Complete Caledonian Imbiber, in which the secrets of Scotch Burgundy, the Craiter, Reamin Swats and a happy day will be revealed, and we'll propose yet another candidate for Scotland's national drink.
Heather ale, yes, indeed. From the bonny bells of Heather, the Buddha drink lang syne. That's been revived quite recently, produced by a very interesting Glasgow chap, actually. The original idea there was going back to when hops weren't used, but other herbs were used for flavouring in ales. Heather flowers were used as a flavouring agent. It has a very interesting character to the beer, but bog myrtle would be used as well as heather and probably in the original recipe. But the most recent version of it, which I've had this autumn, I have to say was very pleasant and definitely quite unusual. It's a slightly different aroma to it, slightly different flavour to it. Definitely something out of the ordinary. And if I've got the pronunciation right, it's called Fruch.
Fruch, that's Gaelic for heather.
Yes.
Have you ever tasted anything that had a slight hallucinatory effect from beer?
I wouldn't say so, although hops are closely related to cannabis.
Some said it was the pith o' broom that she stowed in her mask and loom, which in her heads raised sick a foam, or some wild seed which aft the chappin stoop did tomb, but filled her head.
Allan Ramsay's poem to Maggie Johnston, suggesting it was the addition of the suspected hallucinogenic broom to her beer which gave her customers a buzz. Can you remember your first time? For the Scotsman's beer correspondent Alan MacLean, it was in a catering tent at the Royal Highland Show. He was 16 and it was legal.
The thing I remember most was the sound when that screw-top bottle was opened. The pfft, and the wee sort of grey whiff of the carbon dioxide escaping, and then the smell. The smell was intoxicating. I went out and breathed all over my school pals after that, and I think I've been hooked ever since. Just for the record, by the way, that was a bottle of William Younger's.
What did your mammy say?
I don't think she knew.
I think mine was in the Union pub in Kilmarnock and was definitely illegal. My other first time came when I was a student in Edinburgh and asked for a whisky against the cold. The barman asked if I would like a malt, and a hidden universe was revealed. For Pip Hills, the revelation came in the distillery heartland of the northeast.
I have two old friends who have a wee farm up in Aberdeenshire, just off the How of Afford. And for the last 20 years or more, I've been in the habit of visiting the McArdles. And they used to have a next-door neighbour called Stan, who was a wealthy farmer. Stan would always bring with him a lemonade bottle of whisky. And I thought it was just the best whisky I'd ever come across. And it turned out that Stan was a rich man. His only luxury in life was once a year when he got in his old Land Rover and he went over the hill to Ballindalloch, to Glenfarclas distillery, where from George Grant he purchased a quarter sherry cask. And he had it by his fireside with a spigot in it, and he drew his whisky straight from the wood. And he was fortunate because these casks really gave a very good and very rapid maturation, so that after 10 years it was superb stuff. And I thought it was simply the best whisky I had ever encountered.
If a body can just find out the exact proper proportion and quantity that ought to be drunk every day and keep to that, I verily trow that he might live forever without deeing at all, and that doctors and kirkyards would go out of fashion.
Oh, well, they brewed a peck o' malt and rab and Allan cam take three blithe souls that lee lang night ne'er with sick and christendy. For we're no that foo, it's just a drappy and noory. Oh, the cock may craw, the day may daw, and I will tak the barley bree. Wa first shall rise to gang a coward the cook old the loon is he. Wa last beside his chair shall fall, he shall be king among us three. For we're no that foo, it's just a drappy and noory. Oh, the cock may craw, the day may daw, and I will tak the barley bree.
Robert Burns's drinking song, Willie Brewed a Peck o' Malt, and before that the Ettrick shepherd James Hogg taking the Gaelic derivation of whisky, ushgevea, the water of life, very seriously indeed. Once Pip Hills had tasted the nectar, determined to make it available to others, he went back north.
George Grant said it happened that he did have a cask or two available, unusually, and that seeing I was a respectable person and a friend of Stan's, I could have it. And I formed a syndicate of my pals and bought a cask of Glenfarclas, which you know well yourself.
I think I was one of the original
You were
50
one of
with the
original,
flagon.
That's right.
That came to the barrel.
A bunch of blaggers who met in the lobby of my house and supped the whisky straight from the barrel. And they all thought it was wonderful. And it turned out there were two reasons why the whisky was remarkably good. One was that we were lucky in getting very fine casks. And the malt whisky is matured in cask. And the casks vary greatly in quality and in type. And we'd been lucky to get particularly good ones. And the other was that the whisky at full strength had not been diluted or chill filtered, as is generally the case with whisky, which is sold at 40%. And the combination of the two meant that it was exceptional. And eventually the demand from friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends became so great that in 1983 we decided to make the thing public, and it became the Scotch Malt Whisky Society.
Now, with 20,000 members worldwide and others marketing pure, unadulterated malt from the barrel, the secret is open to all. Now, there should be no conflict between ale and whisky. After all, they're twins at birth.
One way of looking at malt whisky is that it's a distilled ale, because most working brewers in Scotland are actually employed by distilleries rather than breweries, and the ale they produce from malted barley and water is fermented, a bit like the stuff you would drink in the pub, but there are other slight differences about it. There's no hops in it, for example, and the resulting ale that's produced is then distilled, and that's what gives you your malt whisky.
Now, although the first official mention of whisky is in a document of 1494, as a cottage industry in the Highlands, it certainly went back much further than that. Similarly with brewing. It's reckoned the Abbey of Holyrood was using local spring water to brew beer in the 12th century, a tradition which lasted till 1986 with the closure of the Holyrood Brewery. Charlie McMaster of Scottish Brewing Heritage.
The first recorded instance was when James IV was returning from his coronation at Scone Palace in 1488, and he stopped at Blackford. This is in the Treasurer's accounts from that period. Stopped at Blackford in Perthshire, a very famous brewing town, to buy a barrel of ale for 12 Scots shillings.
The water supplies wouldn't be reliable. Ale was a safe drink because it had been boiled at a stage in its process, and you don't get proper fermentation if things haven't been done hygienically anyway. So everybody, even the bairns, would drink ale or would sup some yill. And when you think of Rabbi Burns, very often Burns was writing about ale, but it's not always clear. So, for example, in Tam Shanter, with Tippany will fear the evil, however it all goes there.
With Tippany we'll fear the evil, with Ushkabe we'll face the devil.
That's it. So
the Swats are reamed in Tammy's noddle. Swats are?
Swats is ale. So you've got the whisky and the ale in there. Tippany is ale, so-called because it was the cheaper beer, if you like, the ordinary beer. The weakest beer went to the bairns, but it was also part of the staple diet for many people for many, many centuries.
You got the guys called the ale conners who went around to check how good the beer was. And the story about how they did this was that these gentlemen wore leather breeks, and they would go to an alewife and get a sample of her beer, or her ale rather, and pour it on a wooden bench. Then they would sit in this, wearing the leather breeks, and they would sit there for a little while and shugle around. And then when they got up, if the breeks stuck to the wooden bench, then the ale was of sufficient potency. And if not, I think the brewwife was fined.
Where's your wine connoisseurs now? By 1661, the brewster wifeys were numerous enough to organise a mass race for themselves up Arthur's Seat. Perhaps the leisure and recreation officers at Scottish and Newcastle could revive this healthy tradition for their workers at lunchtime. 100 years later, they were being regaled in the poetry of Robert Ferguson.
Ye brewster wives, now busk ye bra, and fling your sorrows far awa'. Then come and geese the tether blah o' Reamin ale, mair precious than the well o' Spa or hearts to heal. Then, though at odds wi' a' the world, among ourselves we'll never quarrel. Though discord gie a cankered snarl to spoil our glee, as lang's there's pith into the barrel we'll drink and gree. Fiddlers! Your pens and temper fix, and roset wheel your fiddlesticks, and banish vile Italian tricks from out your quorum. Nay, 4 days we pianas mix, geese tullach gorum.
Although Edinburgh, Glasgow and Alloa and many other towns had a great reputation for brewing, it didn't become commercialised until a few wealthy farmers began to diversify.
Domestic brewing was overwhelmingly dominant. But then when the old guild traditions broke down in the boroughs under the impetus of the wage economy and industrialisation, you got the beginnings of commercial brewing. As early as 1598, Edinburgh had a Society of Brewers, which was the first commercial public incorporation in Scotland. From about the turn of the 18th century, you got the rise of some of the most famous brewery companies in Scotland, the names that we all know: 1710, Campbell Hope and King; 1719, Belhaven; 1720, John Fowler at Preston Pans, brewers of the famous Fowler's Wee Heavy; 1740, Hugh and Robert Tennant in Glasgow at Well Park; 1749, William Younger in Leith originally; 1750, Andrew Dryborough; 1762, George Younger at Alloa. And gradually, commercial brewing began to overhaul domestic brewing.
At the foot of the Ochil Hills, the Yills of Alloa developed a following among drinkers and poets like John Imlay.
Awa wi black brandy, reed, rum and blue whisky, and bring me the liquor as brown as a nut. Oh, Alloa ale, ye can mak a chill frisky. Brisk, feemin', oh, fresh frae the bottle or butt. And awa wi your wines, they are dull as moss water, wi blood-coloured blushes or purple or pale. Get folks, if you wish to get fairer and fatter, then I wheat your saisons wi Alloa ale.
In the Highlands, whisky too was made very much for local consumption, though by the late 18th century, smugglers were bringing it into the lowlands, and certain glens were already achieving fame for their malt. Callan MacLean, author of Knee Deep in Claret.
It was really the 1823 Act of Parliament which allowed whisky distillation to be transformed from a small, private family affair to being a public manufacture by professionals. Now, it's interesting that in the year before that act, there were 14,000 illicit stills detected in the Highlands, but they would all be producing for themselves or their neighbours. It wasn't an organised trade, apart from in 1 or 2 notable instances. The Ferrintosh, for example, the distillery belonging to Forbes of Culloden.
The Ferrintosh. Oh, sadly lost, Scotland's lament frae coast to coast.
Burns's poem lamenting the closure of Forbes's Ferrintosh distillery in the 1780s. Another artist, Neil Gow, expressed his sadness in one of the great laments, Farewell to Whisky.
Also in Glenlivet, I think that they had begun to produce a slightly more sophisticated drink, sufficiently sophisticated for it to be considered worthy to be given to King George IV on his visit to Edinburgh.
When George IV came to Edinburgh in 1822, he embarrassed his hosts by asking for Glenlivet, which at the time was an illegal potation. Elizabeth Grant's father was one of the people attending the court. Elizabeth Grant, as in the memoirs of the Highland lady, and her father heard George IV not getting his whisky and sent a horseman overnight up to Rothiemurchus, where Elizabeth Grant plundered her stores of Glenlivet. She said it had been long in wood and was mild as milk, and she sent this to the king. And it resulted in the family's fortunes being repaired, because the king was reminded at an opportune moment who got him the whisky, and old man Grant got a judgeship in India, which was a very lucrative position. But by that time, people were aware that malt made well, as it was in Glenlivet, and matured in good sherry wood, was a very superior spirit.
Today, the name Scotch is known worldwide and refers to whisky, but it was not always so.
The original Scotch ales were consumed by the nobility, and they were known as Scotch Burgundies. And they were quite wine-like. They were very strong, and all you could really tackle of them would be a small glass or two. And at quite an early stage, Scottish brewers got into the export markets. Originally, just a hogshead or two would have been sent as part of a general cargo. One of the reasons a significant proportion was always exported was that the indigenous domestic market was too poor to support a brewing industry of any size, so they looked for markets overseas. The golden age of Scottish brewing was probably in the latter half of last century. You had the maximum number of breweries at any one time in Scotland was probably in about 1850, when you had nearly 300.
For a long period in its history, Tennant's Wellpark Brewery in Glasgow produced more export beer than the entire British brewing industry put together. There are still very substantial volumes of export coming out from Scotland, from Edinburgh, from Scottish Newcastle, from Caledonian. Belhaven do a particular beer only for Texas. Carlsberg Tetley Alloa plant at Alloa has recently stepped up its export production very substantially and brews a lot of very interesting beer for the Italian market, for the Japanese, for the Americans, for the Germans, for the Canadians. Lots of Scottish beer is still going around the world.
I've come across Scotch ale, so-called, in Canada and America.
Well, Scotch ale is one of my pet hates, not because of the beer, but because of what has become of it. Problem here is that while Scotch wool, Scotch meat, Scotch whisky has to be, Scotch ale does not have that legal protection. You can brew it anywhere. It's brewed in the United States, it's brewed in England, it's brewed in Belgium, it's brewed in France. We still have some coming from Scotland, some of it very good indeed, and particularly one where you generally have to go to Belgium to get it, although it's made in Edinburgh.
What's it called?
This is Gordon's Highland Scotch Ale, which is absolute nectar, but at 9% alcohol by volume, it's maybe one you would only take up one bottle of for a nightcap rather than having a session on it. It's brewed by S&N in Edinburgh. It was originally a George Younger's beer from Alloa until 1963. Some people are re-importing that back into Scotland, but generally speaking, you go into a cafe in Brussels, you see on the price list a Scotch ale, and if it's Gordon's, which I think is the best of them, you get this in a thistle-shaped glass in a cafe in Brussels. Wonderful.
My Kimmer and I lay down to sleep, we twa pint stoops to her bed's feet. Aye, when we woke, we drank them dry. What think ye o' my wee Kimmer and I? Toddlin' butt, toddlin' ben, oh goodna my love, come toddlin' hame, toddlin' hame, toddlin' hame. When round as a need, ye come toddlin' hame.
Allan Ramsay's Todlin Hame. If traditional Scotch ales are strong, dark and rich, I always think of Traquair House Ale as a fine example of the style. Another uniquely Scots ale style developed for the export trade, India Pale Ale or IPA.
With Scots being at the forefront of imperial expansion, you got them opening up the empire, first of all in the West Indies and the Americas in particular, then later the newer colonies in the Middle and Far East. And when you got specific beers designed for these markets. So you would have, pale ales in particular, which eventually came along and replaced, to a large extent, the older Scotch ales. These were lower gravity beers, but instead of keeping well on long voyages by strength alone, they kept well because they were light sparkling beers, very highly hopped, and the type of beers they were meant that they kept well in hot climates and kept their clarity on long sea voyages.
In places like the West Indies, so in the 19th century, was a common beer a Scottish beer?
A very common beer. In actual fact, a lot of Scotch ales were shipped to the West Indies, and the sugar plantations in particular, the sugar planters used to pour Demerara rum into Scotch ale to make a drink of some potency.
In the realm of whisky, the coming of coffee's patent still in 1830, the production of cheap grain spirit, and distillers concentrating on these new blends of malt and grain, resulted in whisky conquering the world. But there was a price to pay. For the original nectar, the distinctive malts all but disappeared from the market. Those who knew better thought an integral part of their culture was being replaced with something inferior and verkitched.
Neil Gow was a nationalist intellectual who wrote a diatribe in the mid-30s accusing the distillers of robbing Scotland of our national drink. I think it's a bit strong to portray it as a conspiracy of that sort. The distillers were pursuing a market and they were maximising their profits, as everybody does. If there was a conspiracy, it was a conspiracy of the entire Scottish nation. This is the kind of familiar kilts, tartans, haggis identity of Scotland. I think it's something to do with the fact that the Scottish aristocracy had early on become so deracinated that when the middle classes, trying to legitimate their wealth by reference to a continuing tradition, aped the aristocracy, they didn't actually have effective role models, had to have them created for them. And you got a kind of cod Scottishness created. Greatly helped by the music halls and such outrageous creatures as Harry Lauder.
There's a good old Scottish custom that has stood the test of time. It's a custom that's been carried out in every land and clime, where brother Scots forgether. It's aye the usual thing. Just before we say good night, we fill our cups and sing. Just a wee Joch and Doris, just a wee drop.
It was an image of Scottishness with which anyone of our generation will be perfectly familiar. Thank heaven my kids are not as familiar with it as I was.
Hugh MacDiarmid also linked the demise of Scottish national culture with the decline in whisky in his poem The Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. And all that's Scotch about it is the name, like all thing called Scotch nowadays, all destitute of spirit just the same. But the literati were among the faithful remnant who kept the fine malt drinking tradition alive so that it could survive and thrive in our own day. National treasures like Lagavulin, Highland Park and Macallan were in danger of being concealed in blends forever. Neil Gow writes eloquently of what would have been lost.
These generous whiskies, with their individual flavours, to recall the world of hills and glens, of raging elements, of shelter, of divine ease. The perfect moment for their reception is after arduous bodily stress, or mental stress if the body be sound. The essential oils that wind in the glass and then uncurl their long fingers in lingering benediction, and the nobler works of creation are made manifest. At such a moment, the basest man would bless his enemy. And so, convoluting like the oils, we come back to the conception not of conquering, but of civilizing.
Scotland's unique brewing tradition probably reached its lowest ebb in the 1960s. So-called rationalisation by big brewing conglomerates saw the closure of many historic breweries and concentration on fizzy keg beers. Fortunately, the industry has now seen the error of its ways, and there are attempts to revive some historic ales, including Alan MacLean's personal favourites.
My favourite beer is Duker's IPA from the Caledonian Brewery in Edinburgh. All of Scotland's breweries, ranging from the long-established big ones to the smaller ones that have been around for a while to a number of very small ones which have only started up in recent years, have all been producing much better ale and more variety of ale in recent years because there's a market out there which is interested in this kind of thing. Fowler's Wee Heavy, for example, it's brewed by Belhaven on behalf of tenants, in fact. That Fowler's name relates to a standard class of particularly interesting beer which goes way, way back. Towards the end of a night in the pub, particularly at 10 o'clock shutting, and you wanted to get a wee bit more bevy in before you had to go home, people would have a dump. You know, you get a nip bottle, that's a bottle with 1/3 of a pint, and dump it into what's left of your last pint to get a wee bit extra strength for the end of the night. Wee Heavy was traditionally used for that. When you mixed your heavy and your wee heavy in the one glass, that was called a happy day.
And may happy days continue for complete Caledonian imbibers everywhere. Fowler's Wee Heavy in a steering Edinburgh house, the sea tang of Lafroig overlooking a Highland loch on an autumn evening, a Fino sherry from Sandeman with seafood on a hot summer's day, a rich Cossart Gordon Malmsey with Dundee cake at Christmas, a classic Johnston claret with a Sunday roast, and the opulence of a Graham vintage port to round off any meal with special friends. All of these wonderful drinks are appropriate at different occasions and, drunk in moderation, are civilising, life-enhancing and, for their Scottish connections, worth raising a glass or two for Auld Lang Syne. I'll leave you with an early version of that famous anthem referring to an old wine from the peninsula, and with Ian Sinclair, a Scots exile in Oporto, on how he resolves a certain dichotomy. Thank you for listening. Slange. If you were freezing cold home in Scotland, what would you go for between a malt whisky and a vintage port?
Oh, that's unfair. I work in the port trade and I love whisky. Last night, for example, I had some friends to dinner and they were special friends, so they deserved a special bottle. So I opened 2 bottles of 1977 Jubilee port. It was the Jubilee year, and it was absolutely delicious. But I don't drink vintage port every night. What I drink every night is a couple of drams.
Should all acquaintance be forgot and never thought upon, let's hae a walk to Malaga for Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my jo, for Auld Lang Syne. Let's hae a walk to Malaga